Okay, Boker Tov. So today's Daf Yomi is Shevuos Daf Zayin, Shevuos 7, and we're going to start Me'edras Hashem Yisborach on the bottom of Vav Amav Beis, around 9 lines from the bottom, that the Mishnah was discussing that you bring a carbon all of the Orid if you have a Yediyah B'tchila and a Yediyah B'sof, and a Halama B'intayim. If you know that you're Tameh in the beginning, and you enter into the Beis HaMikdash, or you eat the sacred food, but you forgot that you were Tameh when you actually entered in, and you forgot that you were Tameh when you ate the sacred food, in either scenario, and then you remember after the fact, then under those circumstances, you bring the carbon of the Yored. So the Gemara, and this is based upon a pasuk, the carbon of the Yored appears, this is the carbon that if you're rich, you bring basically you bring a Sirati Zim or Kispa, you bring a sheep or a goat. If you're poor, you bring two birds as an or chatas, and if you're the poor you bring a grain offering. So the pasuk actually doesn't say that you're bringing it for the sin of eating the food in a state of tumah. It says actually in the pasuk, O nefesh asher tiga, if you touch the food. But the Gemara understands it through Torah Shabbat Peh to mean that if you eat the food in a state of tumah. So the Gemara says, "Minayin shein taraban, minayin shein hakasim medaber al b'tumas mikdash v'kadasha." How do we know that the pasuk is talking about somebody who eats the food in the state of tumah, or enters the temple in a state of tumah? Vidinu, and it's a logical argument. So that's how we understand it. So the way we know this, that's what the pasuk is referring to, is the Izir v'anash alatuma, the chayev carbon alatuma. Since the Torah has told us that if you ate the food in a state while you were tameh, you ate the sacred food, and so you're going to be, or if you enter in the temple in a state of tumah, you're going to get kares. The chayev onesh alatuma. Since the pasuk warns us that if you do it intentionally, v'chayev carbon alatum. And we know any sin which, if you do intentionally for kares, if you do it accidentally, you have to bring a carbon. So we want to say, so when the Torah is warning us and prohibiting to do things in a state of ritual impurity, it's warning about eating the sacred food in a state of tumah, or entering in the temple in a state of tumah. So too, when the Torah says that if you do it accidentally, you have to bring a carbon. So therefore, this pasuk must be referring to Tumas Mikdash v'Kadashav. So the Gemara says, but maybe there's another area where the Torah prohibits. You're not allowed to eat this truma, the food of the Kohen, in a state of tumah. Maybe that's what it's referring to. V'ema truma. Shehizir va'anash. The Torah says that if you eat the truma in a state of tumah, you're going to be liable for death from heaven. Chiyuv misa from heaven is not the exact same thing as kares, but they're both death from heaven, but kares is more severe. So therefore, maybe that's what this pasuk, when it says you cannot touch, maybe it's not referring to eating the sacred food in a state of tumah, but it's eating the truma in a sacred food tumah. Gemara says, no, lo ashkachon avam misa dechayev carbon. We never have a case where it's chiyuv misa from heaven, where you're liable to bring a sin offering. Achatas is brought only in a case of kares, and where if you do it intentionally, you get kares. So therefore, it's not referring to truma. And this carbon of the yored is a type of chatas. So the Gemara says, no, ema hani mili carbon kavua. Okay, maybe when we don't say that if you liable from death from heaven, you have to bring a carbon, maybe that's a fixed chatas. But the carbon of the yored is not exactly a regular chatas, because it's variable. And in fact, the other two areas where we bring the carbon of the yored are actually cases where they're not where it's not the case of a kares penalty, and that's what the Gemara explains. But ema olav yored, but maybe while it's of olav yored on top of zayin and aleph, nasi, maybe he would bring that even if he had violated something that was clear of misa from heaven. Midi dehave ashmias kol vabitos vasayim, just like if you are liable for the other two areas of carbon of the yored, which is Shevuos ha'edus, if you swear you don't know testimony, but you really do, or bitos vasayim, if you violate your oath. So then in both of those cases, you have to bring a carbon of the yored, and that's not a regular chatas either. So the Gemara says, no. How do we know? Says the Brisa. How do we know that truma is not included in this pasuk? Amar Kra ba, because it says in the pasuk, Asher Yitma ba, and the word ba is excluding something. And what's it excluding? Ba miute truma is excluding the truma. So the Gemara says no. Amy ba miute mikdash. Maybe the ba is not excluding the truma from the carbon from this pasuk. Maybe it's saying the prohibition of mikdash if you entered into the temple in a state of ritual impurity. Maybe that's what's excluding. So the Gemara says, maybe what we're saying is the low sagi way, but carbon all the yored adam maisi carbon kavua. Maybe if you entered into the temple in a state of ritual purity, then maybe it's not enough to bring a carbon all the yored. You're going to have to bring a full carbon chatas. So the Gemara says no. We want to know what's the source for this idea. Basically, we're asking the question: how do we know that the pasuk that we had understood, Oki Yiga Tumas, the pasuk that we had understood to be telling us that you bring carbon over yored for tumas mikdash v'kadasha, but we had understood that from that pasuk on nefesh tiga that fine, we've established that it refers to kodesh, but how do we know it refers to mikdash as well? That if you enter the base of mikdash in a state of tuma, what's the source? So the Gemara says, Kari Rava ale the Rebbe. So Rava said about Rebbe, Doa Mayami Boris Amukim. Rebbe is drawing water from the deep wells, because Rebbe explained to us the source for this idea that pasuk refers to somebody who went to the temple in a state of ritual impurity. How do we know that? Because he says, Rabbi Omer Ekra Ani Chaya Behema Lama Nemra, because the pasuk states, "Oh nefesh asher tikah b'chol davar tameo, b'nivos chaya tameo, b'nivos behema tameo." If you touch the carcass of a chaya or behema, you're and then eat the sacred food. So I might, or literally touch the sacred food. So the pasuk doesn't really need to say behema tameo because it already says chaya tameo. So lama. So why does it say it here? So Lama Nemra kan behema tmeya, v'nemra la'olam behema tmeya. Because so it says here behema tmeya, and it also says behema tmeya with respect to somebody who eats from the zevach shlamim. Ma'ala and tumas kodesh, aftan tumas kodesh. So in both cases, it's referring to somebody who eats the food in a state of ritual impurity. But ashkan tumas kodesh, but we already know that tumas kodesh is prohibited. Tumas mikdash minohan. So amakra b'chol kodesh lo tiga v'al mikdash lo tava. So the pasuk tells us b'chol kodesh lo tavo v'al mikdash lo tavo. This is last week's parsha, and so we see iskash mikdash lo kodesh, that the Torah compares mikdash to kodesh. So basically it's from a Gzera Shava that we learn that mikdash is prohibited. So why don't we also prohibit truma from the Gzera Shava? The Amar Ma b'chol kodesh lo tiga. But Rabbi says that truma. We have a teaching that when it says b'chol kodesh lo tiga, that is to include the truma. So the Gemara explains. Hamiyat Rahman ba. No, we've already excluded truma, but from that first pasuk which says ba. The Gemara says, "Ba ema ba mute mikdash." Maybe the word "ba" is not excluding the truma. Maybe the word "ba" is excluding entering in the base of mikdash in a state of ritual impurity. The Gemara says, "No, mistabra mikdash on matinan." No, it's more logical to say that mikdash is not the one being excluded. Shekem bekares. So kamosa, because both mikdash and kodesh, if you eat them, if you enter into them intentionally or you eat it intentionally while you're tameh, you have kares. So therefore, it's more likely to say that that's what's being excluded, the mikdash, than the truma, than the mikdash. So the Gemara says, Adarabah, truma or matina, and shekein achilo kamosa. Just the opposite. Truma should be the one that's not excluded, because just like kodesh is eating, truma is also eating, and mikdash is entering into the temple. So therefore, the Gemara says, what's our source? We're still looking for the idea. How do we know that the pasuk that we've been starting with, that you're not allowed to touch oki yiga b'tumas oki yiga o nefesh asher tiga b'chol davar tameo b'nivos chaya tameo? How do we know that pasuk is referring to mikdash? The Gemara has to start again. Even though Rava had praised it, Rebbe's answer, the Gemara is not satisfied, so Rava has to give a different answer. Rava sholosh krisos b'shlamim lama. So it says the word kares with respect to somebody who eats shlamim in a state of tumah. carbon shlomim while they're tamei. It says the word kares 3 times. Why does it have to say it 3 times? Achas leklal, achas leprat, achas letuma ksuva b'torah stam. So one is to teach us that the general rule, and one is to teach us the specific, and one is to refer to a verse which we don't know what it means, meaning to say, so the first one is teaching us about all carbonas. That's the klal. The second one is teaching us a prat, only those kachim that are brought on the altar, kache hamizbeach and not kache hamizbeach. And what is the third one? The third one refers to the tuma that's written in another place, stam. That's it's our pasuk over here, and we don't know what it's referring to. So havi omer. So it must be that what's it referring to? It's referring to tumas kodesh. It's referring to Tumas Kodesh, that if you ate while you're in a state of Tumah and you didn't understand it. They made a Tumas Kodesh, but it can't be because we learned that already. The Nafgalon Midirebi already learned this out from this Gzera Shava that Rabbi had cited. So if that's the case, Tanei Linyo Tumas Mikdash. So that third pasuk is going to be applying to Tumas Mikdash, and that's what it's teaching us, this idea of carbon all the urine. The Gemara says, no, we can't do that because the 3 kares that are in Shlomim we need for the teaching of Rabbi Avo. Rabbi Avo, show us krisos b'Shlomim. I want to tell us if you eat any carbon while you're tamei, you get kares. Achas leprat, to tell us it applies only to kodshei mizbeach and not kodshei bedek habayis. Ve'echad l'dvarim she'einu necholim, and Rabbi Avo says it also applies to tell us it applies to those things that are typically not eaten, but you eat them, like the wood of the altar or the levona or the ketoret. So we can't do it for that. We can't use it to teach us tumas mikdash. And even according to Rabbi Shimon, who says the amar dvarim she'einu necholim ein chayavin olein kares and even according to Rabbi Shimon, who says those things that are not typically eaten, like the avona and the ketores, ein chayavin olein kares mishum tuma, then you're not going to be liable for kares if you eat them in a state of tuma. So what would Rabbi Shimon do with it? It's to tell us that you're liable if you eat a carbon that was supposed to be brought inside the Kodesh, inside the sanctuary, and its blood is sprinkled on the Holy of Holies, that there are several carbonos, the ones on Yom Kippur, the Parol Amdavashal Tzibor, Parakoin HaMashiach, that those are not like the regular offerings that are brought outside. The Salkadai Dechamina, that I might have thought that you're not going to, that I might have thought, hold on 1 second, that I might have thought, oh, V'amar Rabbi Shimon kol she'eino krav al mizbeach ha'chitzon v'shlamim ein chayavin olam mishum pigol. That since Rabbi Shimon says that the prohibition of pigol, which of eating it, or when you slaughter it, you're slaughtering it to eat it with beyond the proper time, that since that doesn't apply to those things that are not brought on the altar outside, so therefore mishum tuma namilo. So therefore, we would have said that the prohibition of kares, if you eat in the state of tuma, doesn't apply. Kamashmon demachayim. We see that you eat those, if you eat those in a state of ritual impurity, that you are indeed liable for tuma. So Ella, so therefore we're back to the explanation. How do we know tumas mikdash is that this pasuk refers to tumas mikdash, that you're liable for carbon all of the urate if you eat it accidentally? So the Talmud says, a different answer by the Nardai in the name of Rava. Shalosh tumos b'shlamim. In addition to saying kares by the carbon shlamim, if you ate in a state of ritual impurity, it also says tuma. So why? Lama achas leklau, achas leprat, achas letuma. So one is to teach us this basic idea that basically all kachim that you eat in the state of the klal is that you're liable kares, and then the prod is only kachim mizbeach. And what is the third? Well, the third is coming to teach us about this achas l'tumah k'tuva b'torah stam ein yodei mai, to refer to the tumah that's written stam, and I don't know what it is, i.e., our pasuk that we've been discussing. Tumas kodesh. Tumas kodesh did not call me the Rebbe. Tumas mikdash. So therefore, it's from the word tuma that appears in all three cases. The Gemara says, but we needed it to teach us something else. I.e., don't we need this word tuma to teach us? The Baila Miltav Kares, look at the Rebbe Avo, cause of Nami Tumos, the Losagi, Webulav No, so you needed to say tuma, or else how are we going to know that the reference here is to an item that you're eating in a state of tuma? We need it for the context. So therefore, the Gemara says, Ela Amarava Asya Tumaso. So therefore, we're going to learn it out from a Gzera Shava of Tumaso. Ksiv Hacha, it says here in our pasuk that we're referring to, so basically it says the word tuma v'ksiv on the top of Dayan Hatzam. Excuse me. Somebody who enters into the temple intentionally, it says also Tameya o Tumas Abo. Malon Tumas Mikdash. Afghan Tumas Mikdash. So it's Gzeira Shava, just like over there, it refers to Tumas Mikdash, where it says Tameyahu Tumas Abo, that so too in our case it's referring to Tumas Mikdash. So the Gemara says Ve'ela Ba'u. So if that's the case, why does it say in the pasuk there? Since we're learning it out from the Gzeira Shava that applies to Mikdash, obviously doesn't apply to Truma. So if that's the case, why does it say Ba in the earlier verse? Ba Lamali. So it's not coming to exclude the Truma because we know it applies to Mikdash. So Ba is telling us Arabos Nevelas of Tahor, that if you eat a carcass of a fowl, a bird, that you don't become tummy by touching, or like the carcass of an animal, of a nevela. You become tummy only by swallowing it when it's in your base abliya, when it's in your throat. So therefore, this word ba is telling us that let's say you became tummy by swallowing the oaf of a nevela, and then you go ahead and you eat tuma after that, you're going to say you're also chayav kares, and if you did it intentionally, if you entered into the base of mikdash accidentally, you're liable for carbon all of the urine. Mar says, but didn't we just say ha'amres ba mi'utahi? But didn't we say that the word ba was a limitation of the truma? So therefore, how come you're now saying it's a riboy? It's adding on. So the Gemara explains mishum de mi'utahu iyater. No, the reason is because this miut is not needed. That's why we're able to use it as a reboy. Why? Ksiv okiga, because it says in the pasuk okiga, which implies the davar negia in the bar negia in the lavar negia lo, that the taveim that are tamei through touching, those are what's liable for a carbon ovurid. But maybe something that's not bar negia, meaning to say the ov tamei, the ov nevela that you became tamei, but not through touching, but only through swallowing, I might tell you not liable for a carbon ovurid log. So therefore, ksiv ba miuta have and miut acher, whenever it's a limitation after a limitation. So it's coming to include, and it's coming to include that even if you became tamei from an oaf and a vela. So now we go back to the line from the Mishnah that says Yesh ba yediyah v'tchila ve'ein ba yediyah v'sof sayer anaseh b'fnim. Now let's say you know about your tumah at the outset, but you never realized, then you forgot about it, and you entered into the mikdash or ate from the kodesh, and you never realized it afterwards that you did this sin. So how do you achieve atonement? So the Mishnah said that the goat that is brought inside the sanctuary, that's what provides atonement. with Yom Kippur, that actually no, that they are tola, they suspend the punishment until he knows what he did wrong, and he brings the carbon all of the yored. So the Gemara says, "V'chiper." Tan Rabban, the Bright says, "V'chiper al kodesh mitumos b'nei Yisrael." That it says about the goat that is brought inside that he serves as an atonement from the tumot of the Bnei Yisrael, and so the pasuk implies that the goat that's brought inside atones for the sin, for a sin of tumah. So which sin of tumah is it atoning for? Yeshli be'inyan zeh lavi shalosh tumos. The word, there are three sins about which the word tumah is used. And so therefore, I might think that this goat is atoning for those three sins. What are the three sins from which the word tumah is used? The big three of idolatry, sexual sins, and murder. And what are the big three? Avodah zarah, tumah skiloi arayos, v'tumah shvichos damim. The tumah of idolatry, the tumah of giloi arayos, sexual sin, and the tumah of murder. I might think that what this goat on Yom Kippur is being mechaper for those three tumos. So therefore, since I might think that, how do I know that? Because the Avodah Zarah, by Avodah Zarah, it states Laman Tamei Es Mikdashi. Begilui Arayis, it says Tama, it says Ushmartim Es Mishmarti Levoltu Asot Mechukos Atoevos Veloti Tamu Bahem. And by Shvichos Dameh, and by murder, it says Veloti Tamei Es Haaretz. So I might think it applies to those three sins. Yachol Al Shalosh Tulmos Halalu Yei Sayer Mechaber. I might think this goat that's brought in the sanctuary on Yom Kippur serves as an atonement for those three sins. Tam Omar Mitumos B'nei Yisrael. It says the verse says Mitumos B'nei Yisrael v'lo kol tumos. It only atones for some of the tumos of B'nei Yisrael and not all the tumos. Ma matzinu shachilach hakosov mikal tumos. What is the area? Which sin do we find that the Torah distinguishes from all the tumos, from all the other tumos? Tumas mikdash v'kadashiv. That is this tumas mikdash v'kadashiv, and the Torah and the Gemara is going to explain on Daf Ches how it distinguishes from the other tumos. And the reason is because you're going to be liable for carbon all of the yored only on this one. So avkam tumas mikdash v'kadashiv. So therefore, this pasuk of Mitumos b'nei Yisrael, that the Sire is mechaper for Tumos b'nei Yisrael, is obviously referring to Tumas Mikdash v'Kadashim. That's the position of Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says, no, you don't need to learn it out from a Mamatzinu from other areas. You can learn it out Mimakomahu Mukhra, from the pasuk itself. Hareyu Omer v'chipra al Kodesh Mitumos. It says this goat will be an atonement Mitumos. Mitumos shel Kodesh. Chipra al Kodesh Mitumos. Read it as Mitumos shel Kodesh, from the tumah of the Kodesh. Yachol al kol tumah sheba Kodesh yeis ayer zeh mechaper. I might think on every tumah of Kodesh, the goat will atone, whether or not you had your dia or whether you didn't have your dia, no matter the circumstances. Says the verse, Tamomar mi pishayam lekol chatosam, from their sins for all their chatos. Chataim dumya de pasham. Now it's only the sins that are similar to the Peshayim. Ma Pesham she'ena b'nei carbon. Just like Pesham, if you sin intentionally, you don't bring a sacrifice because the carbon only comes from a sin that you did accidentally, and Pesham means b'meitzit. Af Chataim she'ena b'nei carbon. Also Chataim that you don't bring a carbon for. And what are those? Those are the ones which you don't know about at the end because you weren't able to bring a carbon. That's what the Sarah is mechaper for. So minayli yesh b'yidiyah b'tchila ve'im b'yidiyah b'sof. And how do we know that this is, if you have your dia b'tchila and not at the end, that this is what it protects upon? And it applies to those that are sin offerings. So now the Gemara says, what did the Brisa mean before in the statement? I might have thought that this pasuk applies to the three tumos. Tumas avodah zarah, tumas gilui arayos, tumas shvichos damim. The Gemara says, how is that even possible? How could that even work? How is that possible to work? The Gemara says, "Hi avodah zarah hechidami." How could ever serve as an atonement for idolatry? Even mazid barakatolo. If you serve idolatry intentionally, you're going to get worthy of death, not a carbon. Each shogeg bar carbonu. And if it's shogeg, then you have to bring a carbon. You can't get the carbon of the sire on Yom Kippur. So the Gemara says either we could say b'mezid v'lo asrubei or b'shogeg v'lo yadalei. He did it. Maybe we were thinking we don't accept this in the end, but we were thinking that maybe he did it intentionally, and they didn't warn him first, or he did it accidentally, and he never knew about it. And so, therefore, the goat on Yom Kippur serves as an atonement. It's the same question now about Gilui Arayis and Shvichas Damim. Gilui Arayis nami hechidami. What's the scenario? Iba mezid bar katol. If he sinned intentionally, he gets death. Iba shogeg bar karbano. If he sinned accidentally, he gets. If he sinned accidentally, he has to bring a carbon. So where it says b'mezid v'lo asrubei, the shogiv v'lo it's the other way. Same answer. Shvichos damim nami yechidami. What's the case with respect to shvichos damim? Even mezid bar katohu, even shogig bar golasu. Where it says b'mezid v'lo asrubei. If he did intentionally, it wasn't warned, then we might have thought that this carbon applies to him. The shogiv v'lo it's the other way. He killed accidentally. He never knew. He didn't know he killed somebody. Or else, like those cases that we learned at the end of Makos, where he just did it, he did it, but he was not chayav golos for those killing. Let's say, for example, he killed on his way up the ladder, or the hammer was in the upward motion. Okay, so now let's stop here for today's daf. Yasher koach.